I want to welcome you all to the next in the series of Paterson Museum Foundation webinars. My name is Glenn Corbett. I'm the president of the Paterson Museum Foundation. This webinar is, as I mentioned, is part of a series that we've been doing for quite a while now on a variety of historical topics, people, places, things, all again involving either Paterson or Passaic County. And so we want to thank you all for coming out tonight. We have an exciting presentation tonight from someone many of you know. On your screen, Heather Garside is our museum
Hello.
curator. And you might remember her years ago. If you were at Lambert Castle at the Holiday Boutique, you would see her running around up and down 3 floors doing things when she was the director of the Passaic County Historical Society. So she comes to us with a lot of museum and historical people, historical things, I should say. Anyway, so I saw a message to me. Sorry about that. So in any case, Heather is going to be our presenter for tonight, and she has one of the most interesting folks. We all know about Garrett Hobart and how Paterson missed its place in history as far as becoming a city of a president, right? We were a city of a vice president, and unfortunately, as we know, Garrett passed away, and we'll hear about tonight, a few years before President McKinley was assassinated and Teddy Roosevelt took over. So, but this is the story of Garrett Hobart's wife, Jennie Tuttle Hobart. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Heather. One last thing, we will go ahead and in our chat box there, we will place a PayPal link if any of you feel so inclined that you enjoy this program and others, and you'd like to make a donation of any size. We really appreciate it. So you can see it there. So Heather, take it away.
Thank you very much, Glenn.
Sure.
Give me a second. There we go. All right. So hello, good night, everyone. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm very excited to speak to you about a very special lady from Paterson, Jennie Tuttle Hobart. I'm not the first, nor am I sure will I be the last person to speak about her and her many accomplishments, but I hope this presentation will dig a little bit deeper and share some interesting things that you may not know about her. First, I want to start with a bit of background about the Tuttle family. This is a portrait of Socrates Tuttle, Jennie's father. He was a prominent attorney in Paterson by the time of Jennie's arrival. The Tuttles were a New England family of English descent. Socrates was a childhood friend of Addison Willard Hobart in New Hampshire, where they were both born. And they stayed friendly with the Hobart family, which will become very important to his daughter later on in her life. Both he and Addison moved to New Jersey separately, and Socrates settled down in Paterson. Besides the law, Socrates was involved politically. He started out as a member of the Whig Party, but then became a Republican. In 1851 to 1852, he served as city clerk to Paterson. In 1855, he represented the East Ward. In 1861 to 1862, he served in the state legislature as an assemblyman. In 1865 to 1871, he served on the city council for Paterson. And between 1871 and 1872, he was actually mayor of Paterson. He was very politically connected, as you can imagine, with that kind of a political career. And even his law partner was later to become Senator John Griggs, another famous Patersonian. Jennie's mother was named Jane Winters, and she was actually Socrates' first wife. They had been married on May 23rd, 1848, and Jennie, who was born Esther Jane Tuttle, arrived April 30th, 1849. Jane, her mother, died June 14th, 1849, when Jennie was only a few months old. Socrates waited a couple of years, and he remarried Mary Dickey in November 1852. Together, the two of them grew the Tuttle family to include Charles M., who became a lawyer, William D., who became a clerk, Minnie, who died in infancy, Elizabeth Murray, who died at 3, Lillian, who died at 7, and Augustus Hobart. And it was Mary who raised Jennie, being the only mother she would really remember. The family moved around throughout Paterson a lot during Jennie's childhood, so it's really hard to pin down exact addresses. She was most likely born in a house on Broadway and Bridge Street. As a child, she was wild, and one of her obituaries claims that she romped around, pranking the neighbors and spending her time playing with the neighborhood boys, her pigtails flying. Another story was that one of the neighbors, the locomotive builder, Jacob Rogers, would actually give her chocolates, which is very uncharacteristic of him when you hear stories of him. So that was an interesting thing to learn. Mary died as well, August 25th, 1869. So at the age of 20, Jennie found herself losing a second mother. Socrates did remarry again a third time, and this time to a woman named Elizabeth A. Weller. And with this marriage, the Tuttle children gained two stepsisters, Ella and Mammy. Socrates would live until February 12th, 1885. Jennie and her husband Garrett were among the family with Socrates in his last moments, and both of Jennie's parents are buried together in Cedar Lawn Cemetery. Garrett Hobart came to Paterson to study law under Socrates in 1863. He was the son of Socrates' lifelong friend, Addison Willard Hobart, who I mentioned earlier, and according to Jennie's memoirs, the two men had discussed the fate of young Garrett under an apple tree one day. In her memoir, she writes, quote, "At the time this promise was made, I, Socrates' daughter, was not mentioned, for it was not until 5 years later I was born. However, when this attractive young law student appeared in our home, I, then a young girl in my teens, unexpectedly played a role of importance by losing my heart to him." Jennie describes her husband as having a genial manner, frank enjoyment of life, and impeccable honesty, which allowed him to easily make friends. She married Garrett Hobart in Paterson on July 21st, 1869. They were married inside the Tuttle home, and she was 18 years old. Garrett Hobart was a good businessman. His obituary indicated that he was several times a millionaire at the time of his death. He had passed the bar in 1869, the same year that the couple were married. And while his profession was that of a lawyer, throughout his lifetime, he served on several boards of large companies and banks, including as manager of East Jersey Waterworks System, president of the Savings Institution, the People's Gas Company, director of the Barber Flax Spinning Company, director of the Pioneer Silk Company, and that's only to name a few. Like his father-in-law, Garrett was actively involved in politics for most of his adult life. He always said that politics was his recreation or his hobby, not his profession, which seems to have been a very important distinction for him. He became counsel for the city of Paterson in 1871 and counsel for the Passaic County Board of Chosen Freeholders, as they were called at the time, in 1872. No doubt with the connections he made in these positions, Garrett was then elected to several state offices within New Jersey. He served as a member of the New Jersey Assembly from 1873 to 1875, and during that time he served as Speaker from 1874 to 1875. He then served in the New Jersey Senate from 1877 to 1883, and he held the role of President of the Senate from 1881 to 1883. Due to these roles, the family was very involved in both state and national politics, and many politicians came through the house as guests. Senator William P. Fry of Maine was a regular visitor at their home, so much so that his granddaughter met and would later marry Garrett Jr. But I'm jumping way ahead of myself when we talk about marrying off Garrett Jr. Following the marriage of Jennie and Garrett, they had 4 children. Their daughters Elizabeth and Catherine Gray Tuttle both died in early childhood. One was 4 years old and one was 2. Their third daughter, Fanny Beckwith, was born November 30th, 1871. She also died tragically young in 1895 of diphtheria while the family was traveling in Italy. This image of her is from the Passaic County Historical Society's collection, and one of the only ones I know of her. Garrett Hobart Jr. was born in 1885, and he would go on to become president of the Passaic County Park Commission. This image of him was taken from a very large article printed in the Philadelphia Inquirer Sun from 1896. Around 1885, the Hobarts moved to a home at the corner of Carroll and Ellison Streets. The home had been built in the 1860s and had been home previously to James Knabb of Knabb and Harlan Manufacturing Company, and then Albert Tilt of the Phoenix Silk Company before the Hobarts purchased it and moved in. The Hobarts began to make changes to what one reporter referred to as, quote, the stately slate gray home as soon as they took up residence. When they finished their renovations, the house had 25 rooms in total. Now here you see the same image colorized, and you'll notice that in this version, the house is not slate gray. The house was called Carroll Hall, presumably because it was located on Carroll Street, and the Hobarts entertained many dignitaries, as I said, there throughout their lifetime. The house was one of the highlights of Paterson, featured on several postcards, such as these images that I've just shared with you. A reporter from the Philadelphia Inquirer said of the house in 1896, quote, a roomy but unpretentious mansion with wide piazzas opening on a well-kept lawn, ornamented with a fountain and flower beds. And the article went on to continue, its wide halls and generous-sized rooms are furnished in a style that shows rare artistic taste. Another reporter writing for the San Francisco Call mentioned tall, shady elms and neat picket fences surrounding the house. Here's a third view, postcard view of the house, where we can see from across the street. And in her memoir, Jennie refers to Carroll Hall as her sanctuary. She would live in this house until 1939. Shortly after she moved out, the house was actually razed in late October, early November of 1839. And images of the house were also prominently featured in the newspaper during Garrett's vice presidential campaign. Here we can see on the right side of the house one of the Hobart family's additions, and this is an art gallery that the couple built and filled with paintings. And it is from these newspaper illustrations that we also get one of the few glimpses of the interior of the house. So this is the drawing room. And this image, which was included as part of Garrett Hobart's obituary and death notice, shows the library. This is the room he was most often found in and conducted many of his meetings. It is also the room where they laid out his body for visitation when he died in 1899. Garrett was approached by Mark Hanna, known as the Maker of Presidents, in 1895 regarding his potential candidacy in the 1896 election for vice president, running alongside William McKinley. He was officially nominated by the Republican National Convention in Chicago. During the election, the newspapers referred to Jennie as a charming woman, the mistress of Carroll Hall. Mrs. Jennie Tuttle Hobart is a woman of charming presence and decidedly good looking. And that's all from the Philadelphia Inquirer, 1896. In her memoir, Jennie describes her social and political obligations as a pleasure. She confessed to love people and politics. In 1896, Garrett was elected vice president of the United States, and despite politics being his hobby, Jennie states clearly that following his election, he took the job of vice president very seriously and dropped his private interests. At this time, the office of vice president was seen as somewhat unimportant. It was where political careers went to die. As Jennie describes it in her memoirs, the fifth wheel of a wagon. However, in his time in Washington, Garrett built up the office. He used his position to bridge the gap between the president and the Senate, helping to smooth over disagreements and create what Jennie called harmonious feelings. In part because of this, Garrett became a confidant of McKinley, who he didn't know very well prior to the election. The family did not move to D.C. until the spring of 1897, in part because the inauguration took place March 4th, 1897. The big problem that they faced was where exactly to live in Washington, D.C. The vice president did not have an official residence at this time. In fact, the official residence for the vice president was not established until the 1970s. In this period, it was common for the vice president to live in a hotel. So that's what the Hobarts did. They moved into the Arlington Hotel pictured here. The situation proved less than ideal, and the family decided very quickly to move out of the hotel and rent a house at 21st Lafayette Square. Known as the Cream White House, this home was diagonal across from the White House. And here you can see it on a modern Google Maps. I've indicated where it is with bright red circle. Here's an image of the house at the time that the Hobarts were in residence. And this is an interior view of the Cream White House during the Hobart family's residence at the building. And this is from the Passaic County Historical Society's collection as well. This is what the building looks like today. Today, it is known as the Benjamin Ogle Taylor House. And the updated address, if you were going to put it into a GPS, is 723 Madison Place Northwest. Today, the building has a plaque celebrating some of the history and important residents, including Garrett Hobart. Jennie attributes the physical closeness of the Cream House to the White House as one of the reasons her family was able to cultivate a special and intimate bond with the McKinleys, as they were literally neighbors. She remembers in her memoirs many visits back and forth, unofficial and unannounced, between the two families. To give you an idea of how close the two families were, during their second year in DC, they had an intimate 5-person Thanksgiving dinner at the White House, just the McKinleys, Garrett, Jennie, and Garrett Jr. This image, you can see that the two couples are taking a carriage ride together through East Side Park here in Paterson when the McKinleys came to visit the Hobarts. The McKinleys are in the front and the Hobarts are in the back. Jennie indicates that the McKinleys were a very close couple. She mentions in her memoir that she thinks the tragedies of losing 2 children together may have drawn them close. Ida McKinley, who was 50 when she became First Lady, had developed seizures as a complication following her second difficult childbirth. She was very weak and often unable to stand or even attend state functions. Jennie remembered that usually at official dinners at the White House, McKinley would have his wife seated next to him, and instead of across, as was expected for the hostess. Often when she had a seizure in public, the president would drop a handkerchief over her head until she regained consciousness. The two ladies seem to have formed a genuine friendship. And here is a lovely photograph of the two of them together, again from the Passaic County Historical Society collection. As the wife of the vice president, Jennie was often hostess at official dinners for foreign dignitaries and politicians. She mentioned having to have 15 to 20 calls a day, at least 4 days a week, as well as hosting an official afternoon each Wednesday when an average of 1,200 people called on her at home. On these afternoons, she talked about having 12 women present to help her with her guests. 6 of them she considered her contemporaries in age, and 6 were younger girls who she invited because she thought they would distract some of the gentlemen who wouldn't mind waiting around to talk to her if they could talk to some lovely ladies. She also mentioned in her memoir there were no cigarettes passed between ladies or cocktails ever served in her home. In the season of 1898 and 1899, she attended 89 dinners, over 40 teas, as well as countless receptions and music halls. However, Jennie seemed to have loved this busy schedule. Of Washington dinners, she says in her memoir, quote, "The guests themselves were intelligent, cultivated, often brilliant men and women, interested in every subject under the sun," end quote. Among the people she met were author Edith Wharton, the children of President Grant, and many foreign diplomats, even the Crown Prince of Belgium. However, everything wasn't always pleasant in DC, however. Jennie recalled a standoff between her family and the British ambassador over precedence, which made state functions uncomfortable for a while when they both thought they should enter the room before each other. She also mentioned in her memoir that when she formally received a Cuban delegate, it contributed to the growing tensions with Spain that would lead up to the Spanish-American War. Jennie was often called on to serve as White House hostess when Ida wasn't feeling well enough. So on top of her own duties as the vice president's wife, she would have to oversee presidential events. Sometimes these requests come very last minute. However, when questioned by a reporter during this time about her duties at the White House, she indicated that she had no duties at the White House and was only filling in for a friend and was happy to help when requested. Regardless of how Jennie wished to represent this added role, she became known as the second First Lady during her time in the Capitol. The Morning Call claimed that she entertained in the White House in gowns, quote, always made of Paterson silk. Garrett became ill in 1899. According to Jennie, the strain of his duties, especially during the Spanish-American War time, were a huge contributing factor. They retired to their shore home, Normanhurst, in the Norwood Park neighborhood near Long Branch for him to get some rest. President McKinley visited him during this time and spent the night. However, unfortunately, Vice President Hobart died of heart failure at 8:30 a.m. on Tuesday, November 21st, 1899, in the family home in Paterson. Services were held on Saturday, November 25th at the Church of the Redeemer in Paterson, and these services were attended by the President, his cabinet, the Supreme Court, the Senate, and a committee of the House of Representatives. The newspaper published a schedule of the day, which you saw on the previous slide. And interestingly, following his death, it was actually Senator Fry of Maine, the family friend who would later become an in-law through marriage between his granddaughter and Garrett Jr., would take over Garrett's vacancy presiding over the Senate for the remainder of McKinley's first term. Following Garrett's death, Jennie removed herself from Washington. While the nation mourned its vice president, the Paterson community truly mourned the loss of a great man who was actively involved in the community. Here is a letter that Jennie received from the Liberty National Bank following Garrett's death. The letter reads, Mrs. Garret A. Hobart, Carroll Hall, Paterson, New Jersey. Dear Madam, at a meeting of the Board of Directors of the Liberty National Bank held Thursday, December 7th, 1899, the following minute was adopted. On the morning of November 21st, 1899, occurred the death of Garret Augustus Hobart, Vice President of the United States and member of this board. Mr. Hobart has been associated with this bank as a director since its organization. By the noble qualities of his nature, preeminently his modesty, unselfishness, and genial human sympathy, he endeared himself to everyone associated with him, and a deep sense of personal loss is felt by every member of his board. By virtue of his eminent ability, sanctity, and loyal patriotism, Vice President Hobart is mourned not only by his friends, but by the nation. Henry P. Davison, Secretary. Jennie would remain a widow for the rest of her life. Her memoirs give the impression that she was truly and deeply in love with her husband, and one of her focuses after his death, her main focus after his death, was to keep his memory alive for her son and for the community. However, there were still a few rumors that she might remarry, including one in 1903, which was actually published in a New York newspaper. The rumor was that Jennie would marry the same Senator William P. Fry of Maine, who we keep mentioning. The article indicated that Mrs. Hobart was still young and handsome. And it went on to say that she, quote, has about $2 million in her own right, presumably indicating that she was a catch for her money, if nothing else. We do know that the Fry family and the Hobart family were very close for many years. And as I said, Senator Fry's granddaughter would marry Garrett Jr. The article that you see on the screen in front of you is actually a direct reaction to the New York City article. And this is in a response, an angry response from Paterson, accusing the rumor mongers of doing that, just that, creating and repeating rumors. This was published in the Paterson News on March 26, 1903. And the Paterson reporter interviewed Edward T. Bell, a family friend of the Hobarts and an executor of Garrett's estate. And he emphatically denied all of the rumors that Mrs. Hobart might remarry. Following Garrett's death, Jennie remained very close friends to the McKinleys even after her return to Paterson, a relationship that we can get a glimpse of in this letter from President McKinley to Jennie, which reads, March 8th, 1900. Dear Mrs. Hobart, you were very kind to send us the fine fruit which we have just received, and I thank you for it. We shall enjoy it greatly. Mrs. McKinley joins me in affectionate regards to you and Junior. Yours very sincerely, William McKinley. And then scribbled in pencil, or pen rather, not typed, in the bottom it says, we so much enjoyed our little visit with you and Junior. Following the news that McKinley was shot at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, Jennie requested daily updates on the president's condition. Finally, on September 13th, 1901, she and her son rushed to Buffalo to comfort Ida when it was clear the president would not recover. They accompanied the widow of on the president's funeral train back to Washington. Jennie returned to D.C. on and off in the early 1900s. She never again occupied a permanent residence, but she indicated in her memoir that the visits and the frequent visits were motivated by a desire for her son to see his father's world. In 1905, she was listed among several other national figures who paid high rates to rent rooms with a view of the inaugural parade of President Teddy Roosevelt. Her 3-room suite at the Willard Hotel cost her $700, which would be over $24,000 today. Today, the Passaic County Historical Society holds a collection of material donated by Jennie Hobart, which includes her scrapbooks full of photographs and autographs of the many diplomats, statesmen, and other personalities that she met during her husband's term in office. She also wrote not one, but 2 memoirs, Memoirs, which was published in 1930, and Second Lady, which was published in 1933. Only 300 copies of Memoirs were printed. In 1980, a copy of the book was actually donated by the Passaic County Historical Society to the Vice Presidential Library, located in the official residence in Washington, D.C. The Paterson Museum is also fortunate to have recently been gifted a copy of Memoirs as well, which I found very useful in creating this presentation. Here's a view of Jennie's signature on the last page of Memoirs. Reading Memoirs does provide us with some insight into Jennie Hobart's personality. She professes to like a good joke and tells many stories of when she stumped or shocked politicians and dignitaries with her witty conversation. In one example, she mentions that when asked about Garrett Hobart's involvement in the American Civil War, she responds, quote, Mr. Hobart has never fought with anyone but me, end quote. During Garrett's campaign for vice president, one newspaper quotes a neighbor who described Jennie as bright, cordial, and womanly. One of her friends, Molly Winchester, said of her, she has the great capacities of a born leader. Mrs. Winchester went on to say that Jennie Hobart was known for her magnificent generosity, and it is that generosity which we're going to explore a little bit more now. Jennie survived Garrett by 42 years, in which time she served the Paterson community with a variety of philanthropic causes. From things I've read, I gather that even when her husband was alive, the couple contributed to a variety of charities, including the building of many houses of worship, such as St. John's Catholic Church and the Barnett Memorial Temple. However, following her husband's death, Jennie's charitable activities become one of her priorities. Her efforts resulted in many members of the Paterson community referring to her as the First Lady of Paterson. A few of the institutions that she contributed the most time and money to included the Paterson Orphan Asylum and the Old Ladies Home, which is pictured here in the top corner, where she served as honorary president for most of the rest of her life. She even donated the use of Carroll Hall for a Vanity Fair Bazaar fundraiser to benefit the home. The bottom image shows a group planting a tree on the grounds of the Old Ladies Home, and Jennie is right there in front. I've circled her. Following the Paterson fire of 1902, which devastated downtown in the Sandy Hill neighborhood, she contributed $500 to the relief fund, which would be over $17,000 today. Directly following the fire, Paterson was hit with a really bad flood, and Hobart purchased 100 mattresses for the women and children taking shelter in the Paterson Armory. During the First World War, she used Carroll Hall as a base for efforts to sew clothes for the Belgian citizens. In 1932, she was decorated by King Albert of the Belgians with the Cross of the Order of Leopold for her work with those affected by World War I. Here is a photo of her actual medal, which was on loan to the Passaic County Historical Society when this image was taken. King Albert, which you also see in front of you, actually remembered Jennie from when he visited Washington, D.C. as the Crown Prince of Belgium. And he had actually had to change his travel schedule because she refused to see him on a Sunday, claiming that she would not receive anyone on the Lord's Day. He had to wait till Monday. So he had to change his entire schedule so that he could stay and meet with her. But apparently, rather than being annoyed that she messed up his travel plans, he was very impressed with her piety, and they seem to have kept in touch throughout the rest of their lives. Jennie also used her influence in putting her weight and support behind a capital campaign for the YWCA. In 1932, she contributed to the Fresh Air Camp in North Haledon for children in need. She was a charter member of the Women's Club of Paterson. She was also involved in the Women's Christian Temperance Union and a great supporter of the Red Cross. She contributed greatly to religious institutions, including the Church of the Redeemer and later the Church of the Messiah. She also paid to build both the church and the minister's house for the Presbyterian Church in Totowa. She supported Billy Sunday when the evangelist came to Paterson in 1915, both financially and through her own personal attendance to many of his meetings. On June 3rd, 1933, Rutgers bestowed upon her the honorary degree of Doctor of Philanthropy. It was conveyed as a part of the 12th commencement of the New Jersey College for Women, and the event took place in the Elizabeth Rodman Voorhees Chapel in New Brunswick. During the ceremony, Dr. Collier, who bestowed the honor, said of Jennie, she had a, quote, living interest in worthy social enterprises. The citation, hood, and diploma were entrusted to the Passaic County Historical Society. Jennie was also a charter member of the Passaic County Historical Society, as was her son. She's credited with being a major influence to get the society into Lambert Castle in 1934. She served as major benefactor to the society, giving both money and artifacts. Around 1935, the Round Room became the McKinley Hobart Room to display some of this memorabilia. Here are two views of that space with many of the Hobart artifacts on display. The room was described in a society publication as a, quote, shrine of the Spanish-American War period, and based on the photographs, I think you can really see that it was. She would often visit the museum and sit for hours in the exhibit looking at her husband's portrait. One newspaper article indicated that Mrs. Hobart would visit Lambert's Castle frequently, driven there by her chauffeur, and would spend many an hour seated before the velvet-draped portrait of her late husband, lost in memories of the past. In 1967, Garrett Hobart IV and his wife gifted a long-forgotten painting of Jennie Tuttle Hobart as a child to the Historical Society, continuing her connection with the organization. Another organization that owes its existence to Jennie Hobart is the Memorial Day Nursery. Formed to provide safe childcare for working mothers, it is the oldest preschool in New Jersey and has been in operation since it was founded in 1887. Jennie was a founding member. She endowed $25,000 in honor of the memory of her daughter Fanny, which would be something like $833,000 today. She also provided the plot of land for the building, which was built in 1901 on the corner of Grand and Hamilton Streets, where we know it today. From 1887 to 1937, she served as the vice president of the nursery. In 1937, she was appointed honorary president, a position that she held for the rest of her life. Her daughter-in-law was also very actively involved in the nursery, and her granddaughter, Catherine Hand, became president of the nursery board in 1939, continuing the family's connection. In 1925, Jennie Hobart donated the family's art collection to the Paterson Free Public Library, a total of 26 paintings consisting mostly of 19th century American landscapes. The gift was entrusted to the library for the citizens of Paterson, and because of the nature of the gift, the paintings cannot be sold. The collection can still be seen on display in the main branch, the Danforth Public Library, today. The paintings are located on the second floor in the assembly room and are accessible on request or during public programming, part of the lasting legacy of Jennie Hobart. While I've been discussing the legacy of Jennie Hobart, she was always, as I said, more interested in preserving the legacy of her husband. Two of the paintings included in the 26 that she gifted were portraits of President McKinley and Vice President Hobart, and today they are also located in the Danforth Public Library on the main floor at the bottom of the main staircase. In my personal opinion, the only black mark on Jennie Hobart's otherwise amazing life is that she was against women's suffrage. She organized the New Jersey Association opposed to women's suffrage in 1914 and held regular meetings. This organization was a state affiliate of a national group. The New Jersey branch was based in Trenton and was led by several wealthy white women, including Jennie. Jennie Hobart's father, as I mentioned before, had been involved in the Republican Party in Passaic County, and so she was very well connected politically. She served as vice president of this organization and declared that imposing suffrage, yes, I said imposing suffrage on women was a, quote, great injustice and, quote, a great menace to our state. In 1915, the organization had 11,000 members with branches in 34 towns around the state. Their main platform was that they continued to endorse the traditional view that God had ordained separate spheres for the sexes. Women's place was in the home as a wife and a mother, and that should be viewed as a nobler position than that of the men's. Politics was a sordid business that would knock women off of their pedestals and contaminate their homes. Jennie was considered one of the leading opponents of suffrage in New Jersey. And as a part of her efforts, she actively brought many speakers to Paterson who were against women's suffrage and spoke in Paterson against women's suffrage. As I mentioned earlier, Jennie Hobart moved out of Carroll Hall in 1939 and the house was razed. For the remaining years of her life, she would live in this building. The original house on this property was built by John McCullough in 1877, and it was a castle-like structure. It was sold in auction to Jennie in 1902, and she gifted it to her son, Garrett Hobart Jr., as his Christmas gift. In 1915, he engaged architects Frank Wentworth and Frederick Veerland of Paterson to remodel and expand the house. Ailsa Farms is the estate, as the estate was then known, was a Tudor-style mansion with 40 rooms. The remodel took 4 years, and in 1919, Garrett Hobart Jr. and his family moved in. Jennie joined Garrett and his family to live there for the last few years of her life in 1939. Garrett Jr. himself died in 1944, the same year as his mother. His widow sold the estate in 1948 to be developed into Paterson State Teachers College, now William Paterson University. In the early days of the college, the building was known as East Hall and then Halden Hall, and used for a variety of purposes, some of the rooms being subdivided as well. But the building was added to the New Jersey and National Historic Registers in 1976, and in 1985 it underwent a major renovation. The building was renamed Hobart Manor, and today it's used for public reception space and administrative offices. As Jennie entered her 80s, the local newspapers reported on her last few birthdays, celebrating her time in Washington and her contributions to Paterson. In one article, the April 30th, 1938 edition of the Paterson Evening News, the journalist indicated that she was having some health problems. The article says, quote, "She has her attendants read to her of the events of the day. Since the first of the year, she has been forced to remain indoors because of failing health, but with her newspapers and radio, she finds life complacent and a natural sequel to the years of bounded activity." Jennie Hobart died of pneumonia on January 8th, 1941, in Haledon, New Jersey at the farm. According to the newspapers, her health had been failing for about 2 years. Visitation to the farm after news of her death was attended by hundreds, according to the paper. Her private funeral was held on the farm on January 10th, 1941, and she was then interred with her husband and her children in the Hobart Mausoleum in Cedar Lawn Cemetery in Paterson. The mausoleum had been designed by Bright and Bacon, the same architects who later designed both the Danforth Memorial Library in Paterson and the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. Her obituary in the Paterson Morning Call took up almost an entire page, and the flag at Paterson City Hall was put at half-mast in her memory. One of her obituaries stated, quote, "She brought more goodwill publicity to Paterson than any other woman in the whole history of the city," end quote. That was from the Morning Call, January 9th, 1941. Here's a generational image showing Jennie Hobart with her son, Garrett Jr., her grandson, Garrett III, holding her great-grandson, Garrett IV. Garrett Hobart Jr. unfortunately only lived a few months after his father. He died suddenly on his mother rather. He died suddenly on September 29th, 1941, at the age of 57 from a heart condition that was very similar to what his father passed away from. He was interred with his parents and sister in the family mausoleum. And that's my presentation. So if anybody has any questions, I'm very happy to answer them.
Well, thank you, Heather, for a wonderful presentation about Jennie Tuttle Hobart. That was quite a bit of research you did to unpack this whole long history of her, which, as everyone heard tonight, was a lot of it was after her husband's death. It was a lot of things here going on in the city of Paterson. So if any of you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We have a thank you from Ruth. Thank you for your presentation. So again, any questions you might have, you can put them there.
I'm just going to go ahead and share in the chat the link to the museum's YouTube channel if anybody wants to see this or any of the other videos that we've presented. This video should go up in the next couple of days if you want to rewatch it or share it with someone else. I think the hardest thing with doing this presentation and doing any presentations from women of this era is they're so tied in with their husbands and fathers that like you spend so much time about the men in their lives that it's very
They're overshadowed by the men. Yeah,
even
exactly.
when they're arguably more interesting or at least just as interesting.
Yeah, well, she was not only philanthropic, she was very much involved in the city's development, certainly in the years after her husband's passing. I know that, for example, she was one of the original stockholders to the Alexander Hamilton Hotel. We actually have a stock certificate from her. Here's a question from Joe. Heather, do you know what position she took during the silk strike?
That's a really good question, and I don't actually know the answer to it. So I actually wouldn't even want to take a guess, to be honest, because to me her outlook on suffrage kind of makes me question, how she would have felt uncertain. She seemed to have had a very strong idea about what was right and wrong in terms of society. So I kind of wouldn't be surprised to find out if she sided with the strikers, but I'm not actually sure. That I didn't see the memoir. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get in touch with her or find a copy of her second memoir, only her first memoir. And obviously with a memoir, she's only writing what she wants to write about as well. But it focused only really on her time in Washington. So I didn't find a lot. She didn't write a lot about herself after Hobart passed away. I think as far as she was concerned, that was the highlight of her life, and everything she did after that was just filling in the space. But arguably she did more good after he died in the 42 years she was living without him.
I guess, you know, you can look at her philanthropic effort, particularly after the 1902 fire and flood, where she helped not only give money but organize the effort to for assistance to a lot of the people that were displaced during the fire. The folks actually in her neighborhood, ironically, the fire burned right up to her doorstep, basically on Carroll Street. You know, so she was very familiar with I'm sure with even the neighborhood of people that would have lost their homes. Then, of course, the flood, as we know, literally came out of the Passaic River and came right up to the edge where the fire had burned a month earlier. So she was, she basically was very, of course, you know, in mind of what the city need to do in terms of giving money to help food and those kinds of things for the folks that were basically put into the armory for a short period of time until they could find new housing. Let's see, we got a couple more comments here. We've got Judy Cohn says she grew up in Paterson. I knew about Garrett Hobart, but nothing about Jennie until now. Thank you so much for a very informative presentation. And we've got a couple more. Thank you, Heather, from Michael. I just read a book about Teddy Roosevelt and never knew the history of the connection to McKinley or all that issue. And he thanks you for all your great research that you did. It's remarkable. Yeah, a lot of people actually aren't aware of that. You know, that we were that close to having a president of the United States coming from Paterson. So,
well, I think the problem too is that unless you're really a big studier of American history, like McKinley is a footnote to Teddy Roosevelt, and so if Hobart is a footnote to McKinley, then it's a footnote on a footnote. It looks like James has a question as well. He's asking if there are any living descendants of the Hobarts, and if yes, are they interested in politics? I do know that Garrett Hobart IV was around in Paterson, but that has to have been the early 2010s, 2010s. I'm not sure. I don't believe he's in New Jersey. Do you know, Glenn? He used to be a member of the Historical Society, I think. I think they live in the New England somewhere, I thought.
Yeah, there was also some reference to Tuxedo, New York, too, I think. At some point, there's a book actually about the descendants, and I want to say it's the third, maybe. This has been a while since I read the book, but yeah, they were sort of still in the perhaps visiting Paterson. Of course, that large collection that their mother had basically donated to the Passaic County Historical Society. Something we should just mention one remarkable artifact that you and Jack DeStefano, the director of the Patersonian Museum, love. It's that model of the Capitol that under glass, basically, that had been on display at the Lambert Castle for many years. That was there's a lot of Spanish American War stuff in that very short period of time when
I really couldn't even go into that because, you know,
right.
Jennie took such a back seat to it, and talking about the Spanish American War would be could be a whole presentation on its own. So
exactly.
I just kind of skirted over that, but she did give herself quite a bit of credit in her memoirs by meeting with the Cuban delegate. She said she thought that created a lot of tension. And she kind of implied that she didn't know what was going to happen, but she also seemed vaguely proud that she had caused some problems. And she was also very proud to talk about their problems with the British ambassador, which I thought was very funny. You know, the man thought he could go in the room before them, but he was just an ambassador, and they were the vice president and the vice president's wife, and obviously they were second. Exactly. and you know, and it was just it was funny to hear her sort of think that she was right.
Exactly. Exactly. So Zoe wants to thank you also for the wonderful presentation. Sharon mentioned she had the occasion to meet Garrett the fifth at Hobart Manor a few years ago. He was visiting from New Hampshire. That's the reference, I guess, to New England. Secondly, she says, I know now why the YWCA was built where it currently is located, the site of her home. The brownstone wall that remains of the site along Carroll Street, where the YMWCA is located even today. So that's one piece of Carroll Hall that's still there, basically. A message from James P. to Heather. I met you at an NGA convention. Very informative. Thank you. Another message from Sharon. Maybe it was Garrett Hobart, the fourth. She's not sure. He was the baby in the photo, so I think that was
Yeah,
the
that's the
fourth.
fourth. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
So
I know that I sort of didn't talk about it when it was on the screen, but one of my earliest slides, there's an image of a young Jennie Hobart, very folk art style, and that was found by the family and donated back. I did mention it later in the presentation by Garrett the Fourth to the Historical Society. So that's as far as I know, that's the only sort of childhood image we have of her.
right, right. And for those of you looking for the legacy, the mausoleum, of course, is still in Cedar Lawn Cemetery, and it's beautiful. It's a beautiful building, basically, and so you kind of get a sense of that from Heather's photograph and things. So if you want to go by the YWCA, you can still see the fence that was originally there for Carol Hall, and of course you can go to the cemetery to see their home now, basically.
I thought it was
Uh,
really very interesting too, when I was doing the research, a lot of newspaper articles where they were looking for, different organizations were looking for donations. They would list that she had given them a donation, like on the first line, like everyone was always listing Mrs. Jennie Tuttle Hobart on the, like just her endorsement, I think probably got them donations, which is a really kind of interesting statement about how people felt. You know, all she had to do was give the Red Cross money and they put her name right on the top,
right,
you know.
right,
Like
exactly.
the Paterson stamp of approval. If Mrs. Hobart can give us money, anybody can give us money, you know.
Exactly, exactly. Another question from Joseph. Are there many Garrett and Jennie Hobart artifacts held by the Museum of the Passaic County Historical Society? Now, you've asked the right question to the right person because she has worked in both places.
Yes,
So
so
take it away.
the Paterson Museum, we do not have many artifacts related to them. The Historical Society has a very large collection related to her. I think probably the least appreciated and most important being the remnants of her scrapbooks, where she had all of these photographs and autographed photographs of all of these dignitaries, including Teddy Roosevelt, which I guess isn't that surprising considering how close in time they were to each other, but ambassadors and other people that she had met. But along with that, the society also had a lot of material related to Garrett Hobart that she had given with the intent purpose that it be on display and perpetuate the memory of her husband. Glenn mentioned the inkwell, which is probably the really big one. Several gavels that he had used in his various positions, and things like that as well. And bits and pieces from, you know, the Spanish-American War, things that had come to her that weren't necessarily directly related to Garrett, but were part of his legacy and people had given to her because of his connection to the presidency at that time.
Right, right. I guess. Oh, there's a question here from James.
About
Is
her
there any
memoir.
way to get a copy of her book Memoirs? Is it an open domain?
So I did not find her memories in open domain. Like I said, it just ended up being perfect timing that I decided I was going to do this presentation and then someone donated a copy for us. And as I said, there were only 300 copies ever printed. Um, I don't know. I mean, it should be, I don't even know if it would be out of copyright yet. 1930, it should be. I did not find any easily, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist. A couple of the pictures that I used tonight, though most of them were from the Historical Society's collection or the museum's collection, were from the Library of Congress. And that might be a good place to start because, as I said, one copy of that book was put in the vice presidential library at the vice president's residence. So I would assume that either comes under Library of Congress or the National Archives, and they may have digitized it because of that. I don't know.
And given the fact there's so few copies of it, a lot of those kind of books don't end up in Google Books because they're just not that common to be copied. That's the issue. So
yeah, and like I said, I tried to find, and no one I asked had ever seen a copy of her other memoir. So I didn't even come across anything. I think the only reason I found as much information as I did about the first one is because it was donated in the 80s. So there was a little bit of buzz about it, and I found a few newspaper articles, but I don't know if the other one, I'm assuming the other one would have been a limited printing as well, in which case it's probably few and far between. Maybe it'll come up on eBay every once in a while, but
exactly. We have a comment and a question from Dennis. He wants to thank you for a nice presentation. And he asked the question, the value of the Hobart painting collection when it was donated. I think there's the interesting story about those paintings. I mean, talking about value, several of you might remember on this webinar tonight that many years ago, the then mayor Frank Graves actually attempted to sell one of the paintings out of the library's collection, and it caused quite the uproar. And because it was a very valuable painting, but those paintings are in the permanent collection because they were basically donated without, to basically remain there for the rest of their lives, basically. So any idea how much the value was when it was donated?
I didn't see anything that said that. I don't think that's kind of a period where she wouldn't have necessarily gotten an appraisal before she donated them. So it's hard to say. And she's got some famous artists, but not necessarily their best work. I know, Dennis, there was a publication created, I think by the library, that we have a copy of at some point, probably in the late 80s. And that might have a bit more information about their individual value, but I didn't see, there wasn't really any articles or anything even about her donating them in the newspaper. It wasn't something she made a big deal about, or that the papers made a big deal about.
Right. And just to be clear that the library, the Paterson Library, does have a fairly substantial collection of paintings beyond the Hobart collection as well. So we've got several Rick's paintings and a bunch of others that I was just mentioning earlier, and things that they're very valuable, basically. And they are the home for those. And so, as Heather mentioned, I would imagine that text back from the 80s probably would have had some reference to their original origins, and of course when perhaps the value at that point. So,
and I don't believe that those 26 paintings were her entire art collection either, because I know from other research I've done, I think she donated the odd painting to William Paterson. Well, it ended up in the collection of William Paterson University and things like that. So I think these were just a set group that for some reason she wanted to give to the city. And I think she sort of selected them specifically. As I said, most of them are landscapes rather. I think it was sort of curated in a way that those were the 26 that they were going to get.
And it shows you that from previous presentations we've had about Paterson and things, that Paterson had been for many years a place where a lot of pieces of artwork existed, particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries. And we never ended up with a permanent art museum in the city. So the library sort of became the art museum really for the city, basically, because we didn't have a separate one. We certainly didn't get the paintings of Catalina Lambert. And then of course, some other famous people who had fairly large collections that didn't end up in the hands of the public. So, okay, I guess we got one more question from James. I believe there's a portrait of Mrs. Hobart at the Memorial Day nursery.
I think that's true. Yeah, I couldn't see a good picture of it to share in the collection, in the presentation, but I do believe you're right. There is.
That's another thing Paterson's got a claim to fame on, right? The very first, essentially, nursery like that, but also the very first Sunday school in the state of New Jersey at the Presbyterian Church in the 1790s. So we have a grasp on some very historical pieces of trivia here on these kind of things.
And I believe the first Paterson Free Public Library is the first free public library.
Free public library in New Jersey. Yep. So we got a first here. We have a lot of firsts, and there's all things that we can enjoy. So I think we've wrapped up for tonight. I want to invite you on April 2nd, all of you will have another webinar about Frank Pinchak, the famous pharmacist in Paterson. Some of you have been to the museum, know we have a very large collection from the pharmacy. And so Jack DeStefano will be presenting that webinar on April 2nd at 7 o'clock. So that, I believe, will conclude the series for the spring. Yes, Heather? That'll be it for this
April is our last presentation for this.
Okay. And we'll have another series. Ed Smike also will be coming back with a few. So keep a lookout on Facebook for us. That's where these announcements will be made. For those of you who have been coming to these, we really appreciate it. And again, as Heather mentioned earlier, this presentation, just like every other one, will eventually end up in a few days on YouTube. So you can send it to friends, or if you want to watch it again or what have you, it will be available there. So I want to thank everyone tonight for coming, and I want to thank our presenter tonight, the infamous face of the Paterson Museum, Heather Garside. So thank you very much for this wonderful presentation, and thank for all our attendees as well.
Yes. And thanks to Dave, who's been running IT in the
And
background.
thanks to Dave. I'm sorry I didn't bring the man from behind the curtain there. He's the man behind the big Museum Foundation logo. He's the guy that moves all the wires and strings and everything else to make our presentation go. So thank you, Heather, for reminding me that we don't see the man behind the curtain there, but he is with us all the time when we do this. Exactly.
Yes, I am. And you're
Okay,
welcome.
see, it's a voice from behind
Just
the
a
curtain.
voice.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. Good night.
Take care.